Um, oh, right. Recording in progress. So yeah, thank you so much, Leah, and for having me along to this today. So as Leah said, I'm Rania Hamad. Really weird, I can just see myself, so I'm just speaking into the ether here. So, which is always a bit disconcerting. So Rania Hamad, I'm as Leah said, a PhD candidate in social work at the University of Edinburgh. Been plodding on it for 7 years now, doing it part time. Um, so my research is on hate crime, people who commit hate crime, been convicted of hate crime, and look at the kind of causes and motivations for that as far as you can when you speak to people about motives. Um, I'm also, as Leah said, so I'm a social worker to trade. So I've been a social worker since 2007 in Scotland in justice services, so in criminal justice social work, as we call it here, so kind of the equivalent of probation services down in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, if you don't know that. So that was a role in terms of working with people who committed kind of all offences and people in prison and so on. But also in my latter years working with the City of Edinburgh Council, we had a piece of funding to develop realised it was a bit of an issue in Edinburgh, and we had kind of higher numbers of people and commissioned a bit of work to look at hate crime and people that were working with us in terms of community sentences or in prison who'd been convicted of hate crime, and kind of what were we doing with these people? How are we assessing them? How are we working with them in this kind of specialist area? So I did a bit of practitioner research on that, and set up a service, kind of set up some, very much using the knowledge of colleagues down in England and Wales, went down to London to speak to the person who developed the hate crime intervention in the area where Stephen Lawrence had been killed and so on, in probation services, and did loads of really look to colleagues down south to develop things for us in Edinburgh. And then also that led on to developing a restorative justice service for people who'd been convicted of hate crime within our service just in Edinburgh. Not a Scotland-wide thing, but so yeah, still very underdeveloped. I moved on from that role and worked for the Scottish Government, and then I'm now in the Justice Inspectorate in terms of inspecting justice social work services whilst doing the PhD part-time. So yes, so partly what I'll speak to a little bit today is just about, because really the gaps in the research when I was doing it as a practitioner kind of really led to like, oh, this could be a PhD. Hence, in terms of the gaps in looking at people who commit hate crime and the theories and causation and the, just what's that all about. I'll keep an eye on the chat in case, because Leah said she'll give me a warning when when I've got 5 minutes to go. I really want to keep it, to time so we can have time to chat and discuss, and hear about the breadth and wealth of knowledge in the room. For people who are here, I had a panic that some of my slides and some of the chat would be a little bit, to use a phrase, teacher granny to suck eggs, in terms of the people that are here and in this space and in research and hate crime and so on. So bear with me. I will gloss over some slides in the interest of time and brevity, which is just something I struggle with, and keeping quiet, so that we do have time for discussion. But please do ask me if you want more detail and things. I've glossed over too much, but just keen to hear from people as well. So, as I say, I've not really went into what is hate crime. I took out some slides in that because I think in this group of people, I think people know what it is, but looking a bit more like in terms of the Scottish context, the prevalence and so on, a bit about the impact. Again, probably we won't need to talk about that too much because I understand that people in this group will really understand that, and will have worked with the research and victims of hate crime and the impact. Looking at kind of what are the demographics and who and why and the causation stuff. My research, and then a bit about kind of interventions, because that's where what I hope, that the research impact will have is like, how do we address hate crime? There's just, so many different theories around it and so many different types of interventions we could have, and what is it that, what works really? apologies for me, I'm a busy slide person. I just like to get everything in there. So then when you share slides, people aren't guessing, you know, like with just start bullet points. So busy slides, I won't speak to all of it and all of them. But in Scotland, things have moved a wee bit differently, I think, from England, haven't they? And I think perhaps England and Wales are looking at the Scottish model and how we've made some changes. But long story short, after a review of hate crime legislation way back in 2016, Scotland looked to kind of simplify and streamline and change the hate crime legislation because it was a little bit messy. And the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act came into force in April 24. It developed in 2021 and came into force in April 2024. So that in terms of our definitions here in Scotland, it's, you know, offence aggravated by prejudice if at the time of committing it, the offender demonstrates malice or ill will towards the victim, and that malice and ill will is based on the victim's membership or presumed membership of a group. So this old malice and ill will phrase, I always find it very archaic, but they kept that in from some old definitions. Scotland then added, so we you know, the 5 protected characteristics in criminal law, but they added 2 more as part of that review of the legislation. So we've got the usual ones. We've got, you know, disability, race, religion, sexual orientation, and transgender identity. But they also added age and variation in sex characteristics. It used to be kind of older language about intersex and so on. Scottish ministers did retain the power. Sorry. Oh, what have I done? Eek. I want to go back. How do I go back? There we are. I'm trying to get rid of this little chat box has come up and it's there we go. It was covering my slides. So they retained the power to add the characteristic of sex. So so that was around, there was at the time they weren't sure should we add in terms of offences that are particularly committed against women because they're women. They've recently said they're not going to add that, they're not going to use that power. And there's been you may have seen it, a big consultation on developing a whole set of other legislation on misogyny, offences, standalone offences of misogyny, which has been really, really interesting. And the consultation is really powerful read, actually, pulls no punches about specific offences against women because by virtue of being women, and that will include trans women as well. So really interesting if you want to look into that. And it introduced the offences of stirring up of hatred, which has caused massive controversy. I mean, you look at some of the wording of it, you can see, I mean, it essentially is, you know, you will have heard even comedians such as Ricky Gervais commented on it in terms of the Scottish changes around, you know, essentially the worry that if you just make comedians making a joke, that kind of thing. But when you do read the wording, you know, it could be things like that. So it caused a lot of hoo-ha in Scotland and amongst, you know, people thinking that it would infringe on freedom of speech. Police have had a lot of different kind of, I suppose, reports of things that perhaps don't constitute a crime. So yeah, we won't dwell on that, but it's been really interesting. And of course, with hate crime, there's always definitional issues, and that's what I found in my own research. Are people truly motivated by hate? So the legislation is quite careful, and then most of it to not talk about hate crime, apart from in the title of it. So as you might know, is it truly motivated by hate, and what does that mean? In Scotland, I don't know if England and Wales are the same. We have hate incidents that the police gather, which is a non-crime, so something that might, you know, it isn't a crime, but the victim or anybody witnessing it kind of perceives it to be motivated by malice and ill will, but it doesn't constitute a criminal offence, and that's not recorded against the kind of alleged perpetrator or whatever. I think the police just gather it to monitor community tensions and so on, and just keep apprised of things and try to keep ensure communities know that they're taking it seriously. In terms of the kind of prevalence just now in Scotland, we, you know, have these figures every year that our Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, you know, equivalent of the prosecution service in England and Wales. I just forgot the name of it. That's it. Crown Prosecution Service. This data predates the new 2021 Act, so it doesn't have the age and other characteristic in it. So again, just in terms of the numbers, pretty different. I'm sure the stat is we have about 1/10 of the numbers of hate crime that England and Wales does, just again, because of obviously different population sizes. So as usual, as always, racial hate crime is the most number of charges. So people being charged by the police has increased slightly from last year. The next highest is always steadily sexual orientation. So despite us feeling that Scotland is forward thinking and embracing change and embracing diversity, it's still an issue. Religion, you'll see there, disability. Oh, I've kind of got them around the wrong way in terms of numbers, because disability ones kind of shoots up every year, which is, I think, indicative of an increase in reporting on disability hate crime in Scotland. And trans identities, as usual, small numbers, massively underreported. As you know, all crime is underreported, and hate crime in particular, for various reasons. So we've had a small increase from last year's figures. Why research hate crime? Well, I don't need to tell the people here that, but in terms of my own kind of reasons, obviously the emerging for me when I started to look into the kind of harms and the vicarious harm and trauma and damage to societal cohesion that it can cause, and that fatal impact at times. The awareness has been increasing. So at the time when I was, starting to look at it, there had been Brexit and various other things, and then obviously the pandemic and riots, and it just feels like it's never, things are just getting worse. It doesn't feel like in any way that, society is becoming more progressive. It just feels there's been a lot of backward steps, so it's still keeping it live. I started to wonder if my research would time out in terms of it's sadly not. So there's lots more attention to it. We've had the Scottish changes in legislation. The gaps in the research for me in particular was around the accounts of people responsible for hate crime. There's not been a lot of interrogation of previous typology that I'll come on to, and the under-researched elements for things like disability hate crime, trans hate crime, the online stuff, and women, just these different elements that would be interesting. And particularly in the area I worked in, social work and criminal justice, there was absolutely nothing on how to, look at any kind of specialist risk assessments and risk factors for people who commit hate crime, and therefore any interventions. There was just nothing. And experienced practitioners actually would tell me at the time, you can read my little piece of practitioner research, I've got a link to it. Like, I don't know what to even say when people have got an aggravator of like hate crime or racial or whatever. They just say, I'm not racist, and I sort of accept that, and then I move on and do different pieces of work with them. So it was really quite interesting to find that experienced social workers didn't really know how to deal with this. I need to do better. I think it is better in England and Wales. Impact of hate crime incidents. I'll quickly gloss over this. I don't need to tell you guys here what it can cause, just the fear, isolation, all of that stuff, feeling unwelcome, trauma, anxiety, and so on. So this is why we do it. This is why we need to look at this. So apologies if I gloss over quite a few things. Please forgive me. It's because I'm just so conscious of time and time for questions and chat and hearing from people. So in terms of the research, so undertaking the literature review of primarily kind of white Western countries, research kind of shows us in terms of perpetrators of hate crime, they're much more likely to be male than female, twice as likely. Younger age range, which there's a caveat to that, because actually we don't really see that borne out in practice. Ethnicity, in terms of in the UK, it tends to be white people. Substance use, particularly alcohol, often a disinhibiting feature. And you'll know that often hate crime is, I had slides before about where it happens and so on, but again, I think people here will know that, it's quite often the nighttime economy, taxi drivers, bouncers, people in chippies, just a lot of it where there's alcohol has been a thing and there's perhaps an incident. Socioeconomic background tends again to people be unemployed or in low income types of jobs and a history of previous offending. But again, caveat to that is people who do have previous offender are more likely to come to the attention of the police and justice systems as well. So there's that bit. The demographic data gathered by the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service in this past year, again in Scotland, showed that there was 79% of them were male accused, and it says accused because this is at the stage of being charged by the police, not convicted. They were more likely to be male when it came to religiously aggravated hate crime, so 89%. Less likely, really interestingly, less likely to be male for the offences against trans people. So the perpetrators or the accused perpetrators. Yeah, so a wee bit more women involved in that. So yeah, interesting. Only 7% of the accused were under 18 and only another 7% aged 18 to 20. So people over 40 in Scotland made up, nearly 40% of the total of hate crime. So it is a kind of older demographic that we see here. But when it came to trans hate crime, they were more likely to be in a younger age group, so up to age 20. So thinking what that might be about. Busy slide, I'm so sorry, but the police, so Scottish Government also did a bit of research on the Police Scotland recorded in terms of their database some nuances around the characteristics of what was happening with hate crime. So it looked at the victims and so on. So this is for, the last did it in 2021 and then updated some of the figures in 2023. What we see is it kind of tends to be in Scotland, hate crimes in terms of victims for the racially aggravated ones, people who are noted as being Caribbean or Black. So 18% and then 12% African or African Scottish or British. So it just kind of depends on how they were categorised. And then we see Pakistani, British or Scottish, Polish or other white, and then smaller figures for the rest. In 4 out of 5 cases, the perpetrator was white Scottish. So again, does reflect the demographics, the ethnicity of the Scottish population. I think at least just under 90% of the population are white. In 73% of the disability aggravated hate crimes, it was prejudiced towards somebody with a learning disability and 15% physical disability. And then I think there must have been a kind of other category as well. The religiously aggravated hate crimes, it was targeted at the Catholic community. Now, again, folk probably do know that in Scotland there's the sectarianism, the kind of unique bits to Scotland in terms of the kind of Catholic and Protestant split that we still see. So that's something that we see as more prevalent, and almost half of the religiously aggravated hate crimes here against the Catholic community. So still a really live issue. 16% to the Muslim community and 16% Protestant, and Jewish people 9%. So smaller numbers, but no less harmful. And 77% of this sexual orientation ones were around for gay males, and 23% to the lesbian community, and majority against trans people were people from the trans community. 25%, so a quarter of hate crimes in Scotland were against police officers. And I know there was a wee bit of English research on that as well, about the impact of that on police officers in England and Wales and so on. So yeah, it's a quarter of it. So in terms of so that was 1,450 officers last year. So the top one again being, usually I think it's in the course of people being arrested, they will then say something, or if they assault the officer, they'll use a slur. So probably in this case, it was nearly half of it was some kind of gay slur. Religion one really quite often would be a Catholic thing that would call an officer a sectarian type name, and then the disability and race. In terms of areas, as you can imagine, our biggest population centres are Glasgow and Edinburgh in Scotland. So almost half of all hate crime was recorded in those cities. The lowest being our Shetlands and Orkney Islands, again, far less diverse populations, but doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but we've got these real rural areas where there's, and it may well be very under-recorded as well. So moving on to the causes of hate crime. Now, again, this is the bit I'll gloss over probably a bit quicker if we can, because I'm thinking just for in the interest of time, and it might be theories and things that you guys are well aware of. So this is just really from the literature. So I'd grouped them really into the, those kind of things at individual levels. So the role of our own prejudices, stereotypes, and so on, anger, shame, masculinity, into those middle level factors surround about people's communities and socioeconomic threats, people's peer groups, community, education, or lack thereof, and then that, those structural bits. So I think I've got little bits on each, but as I say, I'll quickly skip through these so we can get to other bits. So as we can see, there's those bits at the individual level that can then conflate to really, be part of what might motivate someone to commit a hate crime, including that, yearning for group acceptance and that kind of inbuilt stuff that as humans we have, and to not like difference. Sort of following on from that bit, so it's an older study now that in Manchester, I haven't put the date there, but I just think it's so interesting, that kind of perception that people, perpetrators, their own inner shame, their own kind of self-esteem, feeling just, again, usually people who don't have much economic power or power in their own lives, scapegoating people, and linked to that kind of perceptions of losses of jobs and ways of life, and feeling threatened by in-groups, which then leads on to the more kind of structural bits. So that, and I think we're just still seeing that, aren't we? My goodness, it's being played out still, people feeling a sense of realistic threats, competition for housing and jobs, and so on and so on. Not necessarily realistic. And then that symbolic bit about Britain's getting back to what Britain used to be, and so on. There's whole communities that are just under Sharia law. All these kind of rhetoric around like our culture is changing because of immigration. So I'm thinking about hierarchies and thinking that community profiles are more likely to produce race-related offending. And again, we think we've seen that. I'll come on to just quickly discuss the UK riots and the conditions created perhaps for some of that. I've not got time to go into it all, but again, the links to gendered violence and toxic masculinity as well. And again, it just is borne out in kind of my research and what I've been seeing. So yeah, so I had a quick dive into some of the bits and pieces out there about the kind of demographics of the people involved in the UK riots. So, as you know, it was 27 towns and cities across England. We didn't see it in Scotland at all, which is really interesting. And there was chat around at the time, is Scotland just a less prejudiced place? Is it more welcome? Is it more? And I don't know. I think we don't have the same, obviously, demographics as England, Wales. We're smaller. We have less diverse population, although, of course, we do have diversity, particularly in our cities. We've perhaps not been hit by some of the same issues. I don't know. So it's interesting to kind of reflect on the reasons for that. So data just under 500 alleged rioters. So it was local people. I think there was a thing around, well, it's these people who are stirring up things from the far right, but actually the people who did get involved, 3/4 of them lived within a 5-mile radius of where the riots were happening. So it was local people. Over half of them came from the most deprived 20% of communities in England. And in these areas, higher levels of kind of poor health, lower education attainment, and higher unemployment rates. Over the age of 40. So again, that older demographic, absolutely. And just I thought this kind of quote, as it were, from Dr. Stephanie Alice Baker, so sort of talking about, just to almost summing it up in terms of the conditions created, decades of austerity, cost of living, pandemic, erosion of institutional trust, just that collective grievance, people feeling left behind and putting their faith in just other sources of power and authority and going, they're talking my language, I feel aggrieved, I feel. We will look more then at people's individual motivations. So the typology, it's older now. I still think it holds true, I do. I think we just need to interrogate it a bit more, but I think it's absolutely, this kind of thrill seeker, young males seeking excitement, going to different communities, noising things up. This defensive and retaliatory, where we've seen that happening, absolutely, haven't we? In lots of different after trigger events, or people responded to changing demographics, and in this mission offender, far less in the sample back then, but I do think we would see people who are much more far right affiliated and would want to perpetrate fatal harm than ever before. And as I say, not all types do, I think, fit with that. When we've got disability, hate crime, like mate crime, we've got, different motivations. And quickly chuck these in around typologies of online hate perpetrators. Again, we won't read through them, but you can see them at your leisure. But I just thought it was really interesting. And, people that we might work with or might see who are the keyboard warriors right through to people who actually are stirring up hatred, more likely to, actually want harm to be caused to people. So again, useful if people are working in this field. Oops, I've got a wee fancy bit in there, sorry. So in terms of when I was a practitioner kind of looking at this, and what I would hope that further research on the perpetration of hate crime would lead to kind of looking at what are the risk factors. So if we're working with perpetrators and want to assess them properly and assess them for interventions and work with them in custody and so on, as some other countries do. So I spoke to the London Probation Trust and looked at what they do. And these again were some of the individual factors around, what characteristics people might have who commit hate crime. From their case examples, they developed this, which we thought was, so we started to use that in Edinburgh to assess people at the pre-sentence stage, before they were being sentenced for hate crime. So those kind of things, people's thinking styles, accepting myth instead of fact, distorted ideas about victims, and people will know that when you're researching victims, just, about how people perceive them. Not great sense of their own identity. So you can see them there. These confluence of factors that may, lead to someone actually committing an offence. So my research aims were really to look at that and interrogate, what are these individual micro level factors, the meso level, those middle bits, and then the macro level, wider stuff, kind of gleaned from speaking to people themselves. So what I've done is I've undertaken 17 semi-structured interviews with people convicted of hate crime, and they're in serving, I don't know where the word in comes in there. 17 people have been convicted of a aggravated hate offence, either serving a prison sentence or on a community payback order. So they're serving a sentence in the community, working with criminal justice social work. It was across 3 local authority areas in Scotland and 2 prisons I got access to, 15 men and 2 women. And it was a range of offences they'd been convicted of with that aggravator, right from kind of public order, more minor stuff, right through to murder. And it was a range of, it was mainly probably racially aggravated, few for sexual orientation, I think none for disability, again, just no numbers, none for trans, and quite a few for religiously aggravated. So again, quite difficult to pick up on the more underreported and smaller number ones. So really it's been speaking to them, gaining their perspectives, hearing about their lives, their biographical kind of backgrounds, and then hearing about the offences themselves and what led them to that, and what, their perceptions of the victim, their perceptions of society, the perceptions of groups in society, just really kind of really exploring with them how they came to do what they did in as much as we can. So real caveat is, how can we ever really truly find that out when people are telling their own narratives, their own story? What I did find is people seemed really open and honest with me. Very, very, very open and honest, and saying, I am really racist, or or some saying I'm not racist, but as we know that old phrase. So for me, it's not generalizable at all. It's 17 people, and my emerging findings, because I've still not fully transcribed and analysed things, but the stuff there with these people, a lot of it reflected in the literature, what we see so far. What I hadn't seen loads about in literature so far was about the impact of trauma and complex trauma and childhood adversity. There probably is stuff out there that I've not kind of updated myself on that, but particularly witnessing violence and bits of abuse. These people had, the horrendous stories about their backgrounds. As you can imagine, not an excuse, but just looking at that, a lot of grief and loss, often losing people through violence. You know, somebody had witnessed their father being murdered, somebody, you know, really, really those kind of stuff. Living in areas of higher deprivation, substance use and being disinhibited by that, a massive feature. I think pretty much in almost all. Long history for most of them, criminal justice involvement, general offending and other hate crime. People, you know, experiencing anger and aggrievement because of, you know, just stuff that's happened in their life. People using that. I would have said anything. I didn't mean to, you know, I would have said they were fat or they were whatever, you know. People perceiving themselves as the victim. That was really, really in quite a number. Even if they were remorseful, actually, like they felt aggrieved in the situation, but also a really emergent thing about feeling, just as, you know, some of the literature that's feeling that their society shifted so much that white men are a dying breed. All of this immigration stuff, a real railing against Black Lives Matter being shoved down their throats. Why should they have to? So that real, you know, emergence of that, the feeling slighted, sectarianism, feeling actually that's acceptable to them, but other forms of hate crime were not. Like they couldn't believe it if somebody would harm somebody with a learning disability, but they absolutely think it's fine to be slagging off and punching a Catholic person, you know, that kind of thing. Lots of remorse and self-reflection actually on quite a few of them in terms of I think this is why I did it. I think this is where it comes from. I don't want children to be like this. I'd like to meet the person and apologise, you know, that real element of if we had restorative justice mechanisms, people saying they wish they had been educated more around it and not understanding, you know, other cultures and other people. So really lots of still emergent stuff and hopefully some, you know, a more updated slant on it as well. I'm so conscious of time. Oh my goodness. Impact, as I've said to you guys, this is what I hope, you know, that we just learn more from the gaps in the research around the accounts of people who have perpetrated this, and then that would hopefully lead to like a greater understanding of risk factors and how to work with people and just contributing to hopefully social cohesion. I quickly put this in because this was Scotland's approach a few years ago to the hate crime campaign, which really was great because it was victim centred. It was sending that message out to show we won't accept hate crime. But what it ended up doing, I think, was alienating a lot of people because when you're looking at intervening and working with people who commit hate crime, you probably don't want to go in and go, you're a racist, you're a bigot, and I had staff saying to me that they would kind of say that to people, and it just isn't the way, you know, in terms of our work with other people, you know, domestic violence and sexual offenders, you wouldn't kind of go in saying use a slur, you know, you're a wife beater, you're whatever, you know, you kind of have to really get on side with people and work with them and understand it whilst challenging. So that's what I found through my research and through what I started to do when I was in practice. Is, you know, the literature kind of tells us that there's no one size fits all when we're working with people who commit hate crime, but that non-labeling, non-judgmental, and non-confrontational approach, being aware of our own biases, you know, you have to. And it was hard to hear, you know, my research. Oh my goodness, it was, and I've worked with people who committed all types of offences, but kind of with a researcher hat on, to sit as a fairly neutral observer and listen to some of the horrible, sometimes bile that people were saying. It was hard. It's hard, and you know, it's been aware of that if you're working in this field. Should be holistic, as you can see, the whole list of things that lead people to this. Doesn't come in a vacuum for most people. They've had life histories and things go on in their lives where it leads to, you know, committing offences or committing hate crime. So it's been able to holistically address other things that are going on rather than just sitting with a waggy finger going, you must not be racist. Well, let me tell you that, you know, it's that kind of trying to be educational with it, but also addressing other things and not preaching. And components around victim empathy and understanding, awareness, conflict management and resolution. One-to-one approaches seem to be better rather than group work, because I think it's one of those areas of offending and attitudes where people could influence each other quite heavily. I bet that's Leah saying my time. Thank you. That acceptance and understanding and trust. And there's a good quote by Lindsay and Dana, I think it is about, in order to accept others, you must accept oneself in terms of this type of work, in terms of hate crime. So it's about people being able to work on those areas. And the opportunities for restorative justice, as I've touched on, again, people probably in the room have got different, lots of knowledge in restorative justice, maybe heard about it, obviously, and so I can, I'll go into that a little bit briefly. In Scotland, as I've touched on, we've had a couple of things. We had a ADAPT, as it was called, in terms of an intervention. It only went to a couple of local authorities, but we took it on in Edinburgh to actually be a specialised hate crime intervention, to work with people. But I think it's died a death a bit. I think they're still using it in Edinburgh and, in another couple of local authorities nearby, to work with people in a specialist way. And then SACRO here have a programme that only covers 4 local authorities in the west of Scotland, and they're a third sector organisation that just take referrals from, it's like through the west in Glasgow and a few areas, but so again, not across the country. So no national approach in Scotland at all to working with these really harmful people. I was trying to fight the good fight with it, and our new hate crime legislation is, we need to have a community justice workforce that understands this and can undertake preventative work to ensure we address hate crime, but we don't really see that happening, to be honest. Parallel developments were in restorative justice in Scotland. It's still not there yet at all. England and Wales are much better with it. When I was setting up the service, that's who I went to. I went to YME in England and Wales to look at their hate crime service, and but the opportunities for it are great. It's where you bring together the person harmed and person responsible, or in a proxy way, and others to kind of address the harm caused. And that can be in different ways, like conferences or shuttle mediation and that kind of thing. And really, ideally, what you bring together is the victim, the offender. Sorry, that word's crept in there. I don't tend to use that word, and the community are a key part of that. And I think no hate crime in particular, where there's that real community impact. I'll not dwell on this. It's just our traditional justice system versus what restorative justice does, because I'm running out of time, but you'll see the slides. And in particular for hate crime now, this is really derived a lot from Mark Walters, who I think spoken here before in this network, who's the guru of hate crime for restorative justice for hate crime. But really, the reasons it really does work for this type of offending is that it's that real personal element, and the process of victimization. It's not just one incident that this person has happened to them. It's often a daily occurrence, as you know, for people in their daily lives who are targeted because of an identity characteristic. And it allows that victim, that person, to have a voice, to feel more empowered. And then the idea is, it just develops empathic connections with the person. I mean, it's all got to be done really, really safely, as you can know, and managed really well. But there's some great guidance out there on that. So just, people tended to be more satisfied with restorative justice process than traditional criminal justice in the study that Mark Walters had looked at. And you need to be able to protect against further victimization. So assess people before you're putting them in the rooms together, in case there's further trauma. So it needs to be really carefully managed beforehand. Challenges to that are, though, it's not a magic bullet. Hate crime is, as you know, as we've looked at, it's not just an individual motivation level, it's a societal, it's structural, it's a lot more, and we see that going on. So it doesn't solve everything. It can still occur via other sources. It's not as if hate crime and discrimination is just one person perpetrating that. A lot of courage needed. What happens after the conference? How do you manage that if it's a neighbour, if it's, often it's not just one characteristic a person has. People have intersectional characteristics. So, particularly, might be Muslim and a woman and, from a different ethnicity, that kind of thing. The person responsible might have been a victim themselves of hate crime or other types of crime. Is the social distance too great between people? And it's often viewed as a soft option by traditional justice systems. And it shouldn't take the place of that when that needs to happen. But we're still working in Scotland towards where does it fit in alongside our courts and so on, and not sorted it out yet. Oh, and that's my references. Good. So 4 minutes over. So I think I will thank you very much. And I think now time for chat and questions. So I'll stop sharing.